If you followed any of my recent videos, you'll know that I've covered technical and managerial aspects related to problem buildings like the Millennium Tower in San Francisco, or disasters like the Hyatt Regency collapse, or the Florida International University pedestrian bridge collapse in Florida. In each of these stories, the problems were compounded by key decisions made by project owners in setting up the overall conditions and constraints on the project. Whether the structure involved novel design, a fast-paced design and construction phase, cost savings, or lack of peer review, these all had a factor. So that got me thinking about what are the best ways that a design or construction professional can best protect themselves relative to their client. In my opinion, it all boils down to good client selection. Note that I'm not a lawyer, and this is not legal advice. I'm presenting what I've learned in my practice over many years. In this video, I'll cover key aspects of what I consider to be good practices for client selection and managing expectations throughout the full cycle of a project. I'll also give you key warning signs that would indicate that it was either time to put people on notice or to leave a project entirely. As I go through these topics, be sure to leave a comment to let me know what your experiences have been in this area. Also, please hit those like, subscribe, and notification buttons if you haven't done so already. First, I'd say that my best clients are those that I've worked with over a period of many years over many projects. We've grown to understand each other, how each of us will behave, especially during challenging situations on a project. But you can't just stick with working with existing customers if you're new in business or if you want to grow. So what are the key aspects for selecting a good client? First, I'd say you want to select a client that understands the value proposition that you'll be bringing to the project. Part of that is incumbent on the design professional to communicate that, but the client really needs to understand it and embrace it as well. I stay clear of potential clients who make selection decisions based mostly on price. You also don't want a client who's overly prescriptive in defining or limiting your scope of services. You want a client who has a proper level of respect for your role as a professional. For example, I've been involved with geotechnical investigation projects for a development project where the developer wanted to decide the number and depth of borings at a site, or even if there would be coring to confirm bedrock conditions. How does the developer know what's needed for a scope of a site investigation if they're not responsible for the actual design? The level of required investigations, in my opinion, should be defined by the project engineer. Next, you want to look at the details of the contractual agreement between you and your client. It's generally advisable to limit your professional liability exposure to the extent of your own negligence. Also, it's generally better to work under your firm's agreement rather than a client-furnished agreement, but I do a mix of both. If I'm working with a client-furnished agreement, I'm not at all shy about requesting substantial changes to better reflect my scope, fee, and level of project involvement. I'm often provided client-furnished agreements that have language saying that they expect me to indemnify them against their own negligence. Of course, I never agree to this. Another key aspect of client selection is the payment terms or the payment history of the client. I recently declined a consulting assignment because the client, who makes more than $1 billion in annual revenue, insisted on a pay when paid provision. I don't like such provisions because my client may have their payments withheld for a variety of reasons that have nothing to do with my services on the project. In this case, I offered to accept 60-day payment terms, but they wouldn't agree, so I had to decline the project. Another thing to watch out for is excessively high insurance limits, as obviously I can only agree to insurance terms that are within my policy limits. I'll also say that receiving a client-furnished agreement that has lots of nasty provisions could be a red flag indicating that the potential client should be avoided. So another thing I consider is the payment history of a client. If they're slow pay and it takes me a lot of effort to collect my fees, I'll caution them that if it happens again on the next project, I will discontinue working with them. My professional liability insurance broker told me one time that a client will often make an insurance claim against a design or consulting professional when that professional is having trouble collecting payment for their past fees. Funny how that works. Once I had a consulting job where I agreed to work for a maximum of 10 days while the agreed upon contract was being executed. After the 10 days came and went, I told the client that I wouldn't be doing any more work until the contract had all been hashed out. And lo and behold, it was all worked out within an hour. I won't provide services these days until I actually have a contract agreement in place. But refusing to continue to provide services until your payments are caught up can get the proper attention focused on the issue. It should go without saying, but I won't accept a client who I consider to be unscrupulous or disreputable. I worked for another engineering firm prior to starting my own company many years ago. I was the engineer of record for the design of some ground improvement measures on a geotechnical project that the client themselves had no capability of performing. This was a public sector project, and the client's project manager got nervous about the contractor bids being well above their budget estimate. A few days before the bids were due, I received an email from the client's project manager saying that they wanted to reduce the scope of the ground improvement measures in order to save money. This would have resulted in a serious compromise in the design objectives for the project, and in my opinion would also pose a safety risk. I replied to the client's email saying that this change was out of the question, and if they persisted and made this change, I'd have to report them to the State Engineering Board for Professional Engineers. Needless to say, that didn't go over very well, and they terminated our contract for follow-on construction phase services. In my mind, I was thinking good riddance, but my boss at the time was none too pleased. So what are some of the other signs of a good client for an engineer to have? I'd say you want a client who knows not to ask you to do out-of-scope work or work that is outside your area of expertise. If you do agree to doing additional scope of work, you'll want your client to have the clear expectation that they will increase your fees to cover these additional services. You'll also want a client who does the right thing. In my practice, I often have to tell contractors bad news about our construction phase testing results of a deep foundation. Such problems can and often does cost them tens of thousands of dollars. The vast majority of my clients appreciate my direct communication of the results and the implications, even if it will cost them all this money. Their focus then becomes what's needed to ensure a quality construction project and avoiding similar problems in the future. In my career, it's been extremely rare that a client even suggested that I somehow downplay the results in their favor. Of course, I would never agree to this behavior, and I don't let people tell me at all how I should write my professional engineering reports. When I was working for my first engineering job out of school, it was for a federal agency. I was sent to the field to inspect an existing structure that would be integrated into a newly built structure. They needed to inspect this existing structure, and that fact was previously overlooked until late in the project. My inspections uncovered serious condition problems with the existing structure, and when my boss told me to water down the report, I refused. I later learned that my boss and his boss got together and rewrote the report themselves and forged my signature. I immediately quit and went to work for another agency over that issue, and I think I was 23, 24 at the time. Another key client attribute that I think you want is to have a client who's willing to buffer you from pressures from the owner or their reviewers just to make things go easier for your client. There's occasions when reviewers have comments to my analysis reports. I'm happy to answer questions or to clarify an important point, but my job is to not parrot what the reviewer expects to see in my report. I find that my best clients back me up when I refuse to make changes in such circumstances. Another indication of a good client I want to address here is how accessible or responsive are they when you have questions or concerns about how a project is progressing. Finally, I'd say another important factor for client selection is whether they provide the opportunity for ongoing services on interesting projects. Do they offer you the opportunity to grow with them and working on future projects? Well, those are some of the key client selection considerations that I use in my own professional practice, and I'd be interested in hearing about yours. Be sure to check out the link in the description to this video to download my free guide to the biggest civil engineering disasters of the past 100 years, and thanks for watching.